All right, so it's my pleasure to welcome back a popular Forest Connect webinar speaker, Steve Gabriel. Steve's given several presentations over the years, and they're always very good. They're always um, well received, and this one I'm sure will be the same. Steve's going to be talking about log-grown shiitake mushrooms, sourcing bolts, but looking also at some of the economics and the logistics of collecting those bolts. So with that, Steve, I'm going to mute my microphone and you are good to go. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks, Peter. Can you hear me all right? Looks like my microphone is making the right signals. So thanks everybody for coming out during your lunchtime to discuss this interesting topic that's sort of a mix of what we know and what we don't know. And so that's my goal for the next bit of time here, is to share what we're thinking about as this this sort of new aspect of shiitake cultivation is emerging, and it has a great potential, I see, for linking well to good woodlot management. So that's what I'm excited about, and also a good potential to help support people who want to do this type of cultivation that don't have access to woodlots. So those are kind of my overall goals, and we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty of what this looks like and what the potentials are, and really open and interested in feedback and conversation around this as we start to look at some of the nuances. We certainly have a lot of questions, especially around the process of a contractor or a logger or an arborist, understanding what we need, what the growers need, sourcing the material, transporting and handling the material in the right way, and then getting it to the end product. So it's a lot of things that we're learning as we go here. So I work for the Cornell Small Farms Program. It's a statewide, focused in New York State extension. If you're familiar with the extension system in New York, anyway, there's an office in pretty much every county that serves that community. So our small farm program is a statewide program that serves and connects with and supports a lot of those county programs. So we have a lot of different initiatives, a lot of different resources. We focus on training and support of mostly new and beginning farmers, although we do offer a lot of support services as well for continuing farmers with experience, and that can range for anything from technical assistance to business planning, enterprise development, those sort of things. So our small farm website is worth checking out. We have a number of online courses. Peter teaches one of those on farm woodlot management, and I co-facilitate two courses. One is on shiitake and other woodland mushroom cultivation, and then there's another one we do on oyster cultivation. That's generally done in more controlled environments like greenhouses, high tunnels, barns, basements, that sort of thing. We have a website specific for our mushroom project. It's just cornellmushrooms.org. You can see it on the slide there. And that provides a number of different resources, most notably if you're interested in cultivation or in sharing that information with others. For each of the major species that we have good information on, and we know what works and what doesn't, we have a fact sheet or a booklet, as well as a video download to help show the process of inoculation and management. So you can find those resources at the cornellmushroom.org website, mushrooms with an S. And I gotta click, oh, there we go. Okay, so I wanna sort of acknowledge at the outset, as we talk about these things, that I've been the beneficiary of a lot of good collaborations and discussions and partnerships. It's really helped formulate this. So SHIGA is the Shiitake Growers Association in Wisconsin. They originally had worked on a project sourcing bolts. And we'll talk about what a bolt is versus a log in a minute. But they identified a need in the state of Wisconsin where a lot of the forested land is in the northern half of the state. A lot of the markets and farmers are in the southern half. And so in that context, there was a real need to connect the wood resource with the growers. We're a bit more dispersed, or sort of intermixed, I would say, in New York and other Northeast states, where often woodlots and farms are very close, if not on the same piece of land or under the same ownership. So slightly different context, but I leaned heavily on their learning curve, as they're a few years ahead of us in terms of trying to set up this kind of network and conversation. And really instrumental to that work is the company Field and Forest Products. They produce spawn. Spawn is the material that you purchase to inoculate logs and grow mushrooms. And so just like a seed company produces seed, spawn companies make mushroom materials for cultivation. And so they've been really helpful, and it's a wonderful source of information and also materials. I've had many conversations with the DEC, and we'll talk a bit about, at least in New York, the perspective of the DEC in relationship to shiitake bolts and other wood products. If you're in other states, it's going to be a consideration to think about the questions around the transportation of logs in relationship to any restrictions or regulations. So they've been helpful in clarifying that. And then, of course, Forest Connect. Peter's been great, and other folks in the sort of forester network and Natural Resources Department at Cornell, helping to look at some of these different aspects of forest management. And Peter offered our Shiitake Business Network a really nice webinar yesterday, as we're looking at trying to cultivate not just farmers and growers, but also folks who are thinking about how to sustainably manage their woods in relationship to shiitake cultivation. So we'll talk just for a few minutes about the crop itself, just to give you some background in a sense, but we're going to focus the majority of this webinar on this bolt sourcing question. But I think it's important to give some context. So log-grown shiitake, of crops that humans have cultivated globally, is probably one of the oldest. So it's been under cultivation for at least 1,000 years in parts of China, Korea, and Japan. This traditional method has sort of had some advantages from advances in technology, mostly in the inoculation process, but often this mushroom has been cultivated in high mountainous areas. The logs are inoculated with the shiitake mycelium, and then they're basically stacked on hillsides in areas that receive 70 or 80 inches of rain a year. And under those conditions, the mushrooms will generally naturally fruit, and so the farmer just needs to do the inoculation and harvest. We're not as lucky; we don't have usually as much rain as that, and so we have to substitute that heavy rainfall with some additional management, which we'll talk about in a minute. But log-grown shiitake, if you find shiitake in the grocery store, you're mostly seeing mushrooms that are grown indoors on blocks of sawdust in a synthetic environment. So the advantage of log-grown shiitake is we can utilize our log resource that a lot of our woodlands are well stocked with, especially small diameter wood. We can use the woods as the growing environment. So more or less, the woods provides the perfect conditions for this type of cultivation. And so it really gives landowners an incentive to do this, and to also connect that back to forest management. And utilize some land that often is not in productive use. And further, this product, what we're seeing is a really good value in the market, getting sometimes 3 or 4 times the price per pound when compared to the sawdust grown. So the quality is exceptional with these mushrooms, especially those ones that are harvested at the proper time and are handled in the right way. That's a lot of our focus right now, is teaching folks how to understand how to do that. And once you get the basics, it's not too hard. You can really get quite a premium price for them. So we like all those factors of this crop, and it's something that we've put now almost 15 years of research and extension support into. So my predecessor, Ken Mudge, was at Cornell for many years doing research. He did a lot of the field research to understand the species, the conditions needed for management, the conditions for successful fruiting and harvesting. And I've sort of picked up off that field research and done more of the extension work, trying to get it out there, get the information out there, and support growers in developing viable businesses. So it's easy to get some success fruiting. It's easy to sell some mushrooms, but really building a sustainable enterprise is the challenging part. That's what we're really focused on at this point with things. So the process of doing this is we're going to obtain fresh wood. When I say fresh, I mean material that's really hasn't been dead for more than 3 months. So we're not going to inoculate wood that's been laying in the woods for 6 months or several years, because in most cases that's going to have already some other fungi on it or in it. So we're going to have fresh wood, fresh cut wood. This is generally harvested in the late winter, early spring is often a good time to work the woods to prepare these logs. And inoculation often takes place in April or May of the season. But what we found through research is that the logs can be harvested any month of the year. They can be inoculated at any month of the year. So it doesn't actually matter. It's just that optimally, we're harvesting during the good dormancy period of the trees, and we're inoculating in early spring. And I'll talk about why in a minute. Once those logs are harvested, they can be inoculated, and there's 3 steps to that process, as you can see in the diagram. The first step is drilling holes into the wood. Generally, it's about 1 inch deep. The holes are about 4 inches apart, and the rows go around the log about 2 inches apart from each other, and they're sort of offset in a diamond pattern. And the goal here is just to have an evenly spaced spread between the holes and get a good distribution of the spawn material. Second step is to inoculate, and in many cases, growers will purchase sawdust spawn. So it's basically the mycelium, which if we think about mushrooms, the mushroom itself is really the fruit of an organism known as the mycelium. And that's the real fungus, is that white thready, sometimes looks like mold. There's a relationship. They're closely related to molds, but this mushroom mycelium, that white thready stuff, is what is truly the organism, and the mushroom is merely the fruit of that organism. So we insert that spawn, pack it into the holes. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do it with sawdust. You can also buy wooden dowels and inoculate. And then the third step, once you've filled those holes, is to wax over them. Just over the holes. We don't generally wax the ends of the logs. We just wax the holes. And we do that to protect the spawn from critters in the woods, because actually most sort of predation issues from woodpeckers or squirrels or something like that, often they're interested more in the mycelium than the mushrooms. So we wax to do that. We also wax to keep the moisture content of the log high. So we've drilled a bunch of holes in it, and there's a potential for moisture loss. So by waxing over, we kind of seal it back up. After inoculation, there's this waiting period, and the waiting period is necessary because the logs need to have time for the mycelium that has been put into these holes to grow and colonize, what we call colonize the entire log. So it takes about 1 year from inoculation, assuming you are assuming you're keeping woods, it's going to take about 1 year. So it technically takes about 6 or 7 months. But if you haven't noticed, in most of our climates, especially in New York, half the year is winter. So we like to just keep it simple and say 1 year from when you've inoculated your bolt, it's going to be ready to produce. So if I inoculate a bolt today, then I can count on it being ready to produce in mid-July next year. So this is one of the reasons that we suggest that folks try to do their inoculation in the spring. If you do your inoculation in March, April, May, then the log has a whole season to grow, for that mycelium to grow through the log, and then it'll be ready to fruit that next following spring. Versus if I inoculate in September, then the mycelium just starts to grow for maybe a month or so, 6 weeks at most, and then it goes dormant for the winter. And then the following spring, after dormancy is broken again, it starts to grow, and it takes most of the summer to grow. And so I'm really not going to get a productive log till the end of the following growing season. And so then you got to wait again for winter. So it almost feels like you're waiting 2 years for that spawn run. So this is a major reason that we really recommend, if folks, whenever possible, can inoculate in the early spring. During that colonization time, there's really nothing you need to do. You can see here we stack these logs in the woods. If necessary, if the woods doesn't provide sufficient shelter, we might have to add some of that. But we basically just leave them there, and they do the work. There's nothing to do. Once those logs have colonized, so again, 12 months from inoculation, they should be ready to go. Sometimes earlier, sometimes it takes a little longer. They can be forced to fruit, and this is the real beneficial aspect of this type of mushroom cultivation. So there's other species of mushrooms we can grow in the woods. Many of those fruit on their own timetable. So often in the spring or in the fall, sometimes both, sometimes just in the summer. It's really hard to know, frankly, when most mushroom species that it can be inoculated in the woods are going to fruit. So the shiitake is different because with this soaking, it's also referred to as forcing. We create the conditions that seem to stimulate an excessive amount of fruiting. And so logs submerged in water for 24 hours generally will start to pin mushrooms about 2 or 3 days after they're pulled out of the water. So you set them up on a rack or lean them up against a tree. They'll fruit in about 7 to 10 days after that soaking event. They'll be ready to harvest. So this is great news for a farmer or landowner who wants to get reliable production, whether that's because you just want to eat mushrooms every week or because you're interested in selling them. So again, most of my work is with farmers thinking about wanting to grow and sell these. So it's a very enticing thing to say, basically from June 1st through October 15th every year, you can soak logs every week, and you can get a reliable mushroom harvest every week for those 18 to 20 weeks. Some years you can start earlier, and some years you can go later. I remember a couple winters ago, it felt like it was still summer or fall into late November, and we were soaking logs until about Thanksgiving time. So that was an abnormally warm November that year. So the requirements for fruiting are generally temperatures in the 50s and 60s are going to produce really good, reliable mushrooms. So we're going to focus in on the bolt aspect. If there are any questions about cultivation, I'm happy to answer those. And again, I'll refer you to cornellmushrooms.org. There's a really excellent guide there. It's a free download. It's about a 50-page guide called The Best Management Practices for Log-Grown Shiitake Cultivation in the Northeast, although a lot of it applies to other climates as well. And that really gets into the nitty-gritty of all these aspects that I kind of just breezed over. So I'll just answer a couple questions here. Carl's asking how long the mushroom spawn can be stored. It's a great question. If you purchase it from a company, when it arrives, you want to generally keep it in the fridge. And once you've opened that bag, you want to use it within a month or so. Because once you've opened the bag, there's a risk of contamination. So you try to use it as quickly as possible. And Jen, I see, is asking if they fruit late and it gets cold fast, will they just freeze? Yeah, the late fall fruiting is an interesting time. What I find is I said 7 to 10 days from soaking to fruiting. That can get extended in colder temperatures sometimes. Sometimes the logs freeze, and sometimes they just won't grow anymore. So you might have a bunch of immature mushrooms that are still perfectly edible, just won't get as large as the other ones. Great. So let's talk about what a bolt is and how we're going to source these and what the potential is for what I see as another aspect of a good multifunctional woodland economy. So if you're a woodlot owner or you're advising woodlot owners or you're a farmer, when you're looking at the forest, you might see the potential for timber on a sustainable rotation. You might see the potential for firewood harvesting. You might see, if you have locust, you might see the potential for harvesting fence posts, all sorts of things. So what I see is that excites me in the sort of aspect of this is the potential to have just another good yield from the woods. So I think this is great because it really opens the door for many more people to get involved. So there's people out there I know that are interested in supplying mushroom bolts, but aren't actually interested in growing the mushrooms themselves. I actually trade with someone for mushroom bolts who doesn't want to grow the mushrooms, but he likes to eat them. So we often trade mushrooms for those bolts. There might be some operations, and I know some folks who are interested in both growing mushrooms, providing themselves with good bolts, and also selling bolts to others who don't have access to land or don't want to do the work. So lots of different scenarios here, and basically anyone with access to a woodlot has a potential interest in this. So what's a bolt? A bolt is basically what we're looking for is a log that is 4 to 8 inches in diameter and generally about 36 to 40 inches long, so about 3 feet long. That size and width is flexible. You can inoculate larger bolts, but generally over 8 inches, it becomes harder to manage, to carry around basically. And generally longer than 40 inches, also just difficult from a movement standpoint. But we've seen people, I have a grower who uses his tractor to manage bolts, and so he's cutting them a little bit longer, but he's using the forks on his tractor, so it's a little bit different. You can also go shorter. I wouldn't go any shorter than 18 inches. Most of those shorter bolts are used by homeowners who want to just produce some mushrooms for themselves. A bolt, we would say, is intended for mushroom production. We differentiate, and I am still working on changing my language. A log means many different things to many people. So if we say bolt, it's easy to distinguish it from mushroom cultivation. And so that helps us kind of avoid confusion, all right? We're not clear. We don't have any good survey data to say, well, this is exactly the demand for bolts, all right? And I wouldn't say, if you're interested in selling bolts, that there's necessarily a huge market that's going to come knocking at your door, banging the door down, demanding bolts. But what I will say is that we see the demand and the curiosity around mushrooms to be among the highest of any topic we talk about in farming. So the courses we do, the workshops we hold, the other extension offices we work with, the folks are just always asking, really curious, and always filling the classes that we offer on mushroom cultivation. A few years ago, we had almost no log-grown shiitake growers in New York State. In 2015, we did a survey, and there's about 50 commercial growers, and there's probably 200 to 300 hobby growers, and that number is likely increased. We haven't updated that survey, but right now, I know in my Shiitake Business Network, this is a grant-funded program that we're working on. We have another 40 people who are dead set and committed on starting a commercial mushroom enterprise. And we had over 250 applications to be in that group from many people around the state and that are interested in cultivation. So there's big demand out there. But it's not going to be the same as if you're looking for timber harvest, where this market has been established, been around for a long time, and there's some clear pathways. So that's the real interesting part to figuring out how to develop this. What I've seen from my experience, sort of anecdotally, and what I've heard is participants in every workshop, every class, whenever I mention it, there's a real high demand for, I'd like to source my bolts. I'd be interested in figuring that out and finding and connecting to people that have that material available. So some of the best potential customers I see for these would be folks who don't have woodlots. So we've connected successfully some folks in New York City, in Rochester, and in Syracuse with woodlot owners. So those folks, when you're living in a city, sometimes it feels like getting a bolt would be the hardest thing possible. But for me, living in the country, I feel like they're just all around me, right? They're just ready to be harvested. So good potential markets there. There's a lot of folks who don't have the skills, nor do they want to cut down and move trees. And I think safety is an important thing to mention here. If you're getting into mushroom farming, but you don't want to invest in the safety gear and the time and energy necessary to learn how to safely use a chainsaw, then I don't really think you should use a chainsaw. And I don't think you really necessarily need to if you want to be a shiitake mushroom grower. Because again, there's other folks that do that for a living or do that on the weekends or interested in pursuing safe techniques for felling and moving logs. And so those can be great folks to support and get your bolts from. And then there's folks like me who frankly in many cases are too busy sometimes to get the bolts. So the last 2 years I've actually purchased the majority of my mushroom bolts from my friend who does he's a technical service provider, does a number of contracts for NRCS, does a lot of timber stand improvement projects for wildlife habitat, and so has access to a lot of material. He's really interested in figuring out what other markets he can serve, and so he's been able to supply me and several other growers in the region with bolts. And when I did the math for my own skill, I do like to run a chainsaw. I do enjoy it, but I'm not the fastest person, and I'm prone to snagging a tree as I try to cut it down and getting it caught up in another tree. I am human, and so if I end up going out and I think I'm going to cut 100 bolts in an afternoon, and I snag a tree, suddenly, there goes my afternoon, right? I'm spending the rest of the day maybe getting that tree out. So I kept records for a few years on the labor and the time it took me to cut my bolts. And it's actually, if I want to pay myself, value my time at $10 an hour, it actually can be cheaper to just buy them from someone else who's got the equipment, who's already in the woods, and it's easier for them to pull that material out. So it's a cost benefit analysis. It depends on what time resources you have, but I think there's a lot of folks out there who might enjoy the work, but might not always have the time. All right, so let's look at sort of what we're after here. The basic summary for what makes a good bolt is wood that's freshly cut, that's of the desired species, of course, that's going to work for mushroom cultivation, and is minimally damaged. And that last point is the most important one, and probably the most challenging from the contractor's perspective. The folks that are used to working with wood have some care, but don't need to be concerned too much with maintaining quality. And when I mean quality is we don't want to see logs that are scraped up, that are scarred, that are full of damage, defect, and disease. So they really need to be in good shape. And so that's really going to change. It's not as easy to drag logs out of the woods and not have that kind of effect. So here's an example. This is a load of logs I was delivered this spring. I've had to work, and I think this is an important point for folks listening to this webinar, that we really need to work on building a relationship with the person who's going to be sourcing our bolts to help them over time understand what we're really looking for. And at first, you need to be a little bit choosy and a little bit particular. So the first few years I worked with my friend, he would give me all sorts of different sizes. He often gave me a lot of very large diameter bolts that became very heavy. He also had a lot of log damage, and so I would visit his woodlot or the site he was working at. I would also, when he delivered the logs, I would sort through with him and say, well, this is acceptable, this is not an acceptable bolt. And so it's important for us to learn what those things are and to have that ongoing relationship. It's really similar to having a contractor do your plumbing or your electricity. Over time, getting really clear on what you need and finding someone who's really competent and willing to do good quality work is going to be really essential. And so, frankly, I think some people in the industry are up for that, and some people aren't going to be, and that's okay. We don't need to. Not everyone has to supply these, but if we're going to have folks supply these, they're going to have to pay attention to minimizing damage. Our preferred species of wood, the best for shiitake anyway, would be oak, sugar maple, and American beech. Those are the top three. Those are the ones that Cornell, we've done a number of research trials on. We found them pretty much to be of the same productive value. And so I'd recommend those as sort of top tier. And then good species that are sort of second tier but work pretty well would be the American hornbeam, the hop hornbeam, and the birch are all also great species to work with. So those tend to be, at least in our region here, less available. I mean, they're available in smaller quantities, but the bulk of what we can get access to is often oak, sugar maple, and beech. So all good options there. And I mentioned before that the timing of the cut is important for a number of different reasons. What we found through research, we cut inoculated logs in January, February, March, April, every single month of the year. And it always works. But what we found is it's slightly better if we do the cutting and inoculating in the winter and the spring. One of the caveats to that, though, is that sometimes in late spring, different times of year when the sap is running, we can have this problem called bark slip. And bark slip is where the logs are extra prone to damage. There's lots of sap moving through them, and so they're very vulnerable to that kind of problem. So it also kind of depends what I've found personally on the species and on how old they are and how well the bark is formed, because I've cut plenty of sugar maple trees during sap run and had no problems. And then this year, we had a bunch that expressed a lot more bark slip, and we had a lot more damage on that residual bark on the outside of the log. So there's a bit of dependency there. It's just something to pay attention to, and really good harvesters will try to avoid that time of year for harvesting. So December and January are really nice, ideal months in many cases to do this, and sometimes into early February. And there's a good reason to do it at that time of year as well. The forest floor is usually frozen. We're going to do less damage to the herbaceous plants in the understory. It's often, if you're felling the trees yourself, easier to see the canopy and make a good directional felling attempt when you don't have a full leafed out canopy. So these are kind of the ideals. Again, we can do this really at any point in the year. So we can't really inoculate or justify the use of trees that have a lot of disease in them. And so trees that are highly infected, what we found is they may not be worth it. They're probably best suited for the firewood pile. In many cases, this is some type of nectaria canker fungus that's infected a tree here. You can see in the slide. If this log were longer, we could just cut off this section, and in many cases, if we just go 3 or 4 inches on either side of the scar, we find clean, healthy wood. And so oftentimes we can just cut that portion out. But we can't include this in our inoculation. It's not going to work for shiitake. In a similar vein, if we have heartwood internal rot, anything like this isn't going to be good. While the mushroom does prefer to colonize the outer regions of the sapwood, this kind of inner heartwood or this kind of exposure is not going to be acceptable. So again, in some cases, we can head down the log 4 inches there and cut that off, and we might be good to go, but it is something to be aware of. What we've found with beech, folks are probably familiar that beech is susceptible to beech bark disease, which is really a combination of an insect that bores into the tree and then a fungus. We found actually that fungus tends to live just underneath the bark and really is sort of using that space. And so as long as the bark is still sufficiently intact, meaning it's not flaking off or falling off or exposing that inner wood to drying out, it actually is acceptable to use diseased beech for inoculation. So just because there's disease doesn't mean the tree won't work. If it's an outer bark disease, it seems to be okay. But if we're getting into heartwood diseases, or we have inner rot with the wood, or we have sections of the tree that are really damaged because of those diseases internally in the wood, then we need to either cut them out or avoid those trees altogether. And so here, another similar, we can see some evidence of heart rot in this tree. I wouldn't use this as we're cutting through our logs. It's really important to look for these. We really want to see clean inner wood. If we see any of this kind of disease or remnant of, this is the tree walling itself off and protecting itself as it grows. There's just not a lot of available wood. If you see that real ring of light wood around the edge, there's some available material, but very little that the shiitake is really going to feed on. So again, cut this out or avoid the tree altogether if we can't find any clean wood. And this is the most common thing we see with damage, is really just the effect of logs being, thrown together, banged together, moved around, and we just lose it. And again, the effect of a slippy bark can really maximize this problem. So our recommendation is that less than 10% damage is an acceptable amount. But if we have more than that, then the log isn't really viable for production. So this really gets into the heart of the challenge from a management perspective, is of getting a bolt from the woods to the grower. So we think about all the things that could happen in the felling of the tree, the skidding or the loading of the tree into a trailer or a truck or something like that. Every time the log is picked up and moved, is it being thrown or tossed versus being dropped or gently placed? How are they being stacked? How are they being transported? All these factors can lead to more or less damage in the wood. And so it really takes extra care and thought. There's certainly ways to skid wood out of the woods without doing damage, but we recommend that folks think about a wagon or a trailer or a truck, or a lot of folks who are logging with tractors will use the forks on the front of their truck as a good strategy for moving wood. So just thinking about how to minimize that. And I'm constantly, with the folks that work on our farm, I'm constantly trying to calm them down, because they like to toss the logs around and bang them up against each other. And that just exacerbates the problem over time. So we try to lift and move logs with sort of gentle care. And this is going to be somewhat out of the scope. We're not going to get too deep into this, but what's important from a sustainability perspective with forest management is that we're not going to the woods looking merely for shiitake bolts or other mushroom wood and just cherry picking what we want for that purpose. We should be harvesting this wood as the byproduct of good forest management for the health of that woods. And this is very easy to achieve. I was just in a woodlot at the Cornell Research, the Arnott Forest. We're looking at plenty of examples where we can do good thinning. We can support our crop trees, our residual trees, and have plenty of mushroom material. So there's really no excuse to not do that. But a lot of old shiitake books would say that you need to go in the woods, you got to find the most perfectly straight, perfectly formed, ideal trees and harvest those for mushrooms. And the reality is the mushrooms don't actually care about that. Their purpose in the ecological sense is to decay wood as it dies in the forest. So again, we need to avoid material that's already sort of been colonized by other fungus, but we can do this kind of thinning and pull out some of those crooked trees, some of those trees that aren't going to be in the long-term canopy, and we can use those for our cultivation. So it's really important that we come at it from that angle. We look at a forest management plan, we work with a forester, we make sure that we're doing good by the woods as we harvest this material. And I think in the conversations I've been having with Peter, I think a really key point is that if you look at a stand of woods like this, not all these trees are going to be suitable for mushroom cultivation. And so there's a bit of a sorting process as well to think about, well, what trees are just residual beneficial trees for the forest, or maybe they're timber sometime down the line. What trees are valuable for wildlife that I'm going to leave? What trees might be most appropriate for firewood? What trees might be good for mushroom wood? So there's a bit of sorting into different uses that's going to happen. And just because a species is there doesn't mean it's necessarily the best for shiitake. It might be better for firewood, for instance, if it's infected with a fungus. And a point I really like to make out is when a lot of folks walk into woods, when I'm first educating sort of people not as familiar with forest ecology management, is there's a big assumption out there that the diameter of the tree is gonna determine its age. And so I can kind of determine as I'm thinking about and thinning, if I cut these large diameter trees, what it's going to do is open up space for these smaller diameter trees to fill in the canopy. And in some circumstances that might be the case, but in most cases, what we're encountering in our woods are what we call even-aged stands. And so we have trees that are essentially part of the same generation, and two trees standing next to each other could be entirely different in size, but actually be pretty much the same age. And this slide here gives a really good example of that. This is on Brett Chedzoy's farm, who's a county forester with Schuyler County Extension, and also works at the Arnott Forest and does a number of different great projects around the state. This is on his farm where he's cut a sugar maple here, about 90 years old on that large stump, about 24 inches in diameter or so. And then right next to it, same soil, same growing conditions. He has a 4 or 5 inch diameter maple, 90 years old, right? So obviously one of these trees has expressed more vigor. It's better adapted to the site. Its genetics are more predisposed. And also there's potentially a bit of luck in terms of which tree was able to get some space. But regardless, there's two issues in this scenario. One is that while the small diameter tree is going to be more suitable for mushroom cultivation, that real slow growth and tightness of the rings may actually lead to sort of a less benefit for the mushrooms. And we're going to look at that here in a minute. So here's an example here. I really have found in several instances that thinning can do really well in concert with other management. So this is our sugar bush at our farm. We just have a small couple hundred trees that we manage and tap. But when we initially got there, we identified, we looked at the species, we calculated basal area, we looked at the stocking, we determined it was an even age stand. We did all these things. We noticed the presence of some fungal diseases, and so we did an initial thinning to support our crop trees. And out of those initial thinnings, and we've done a couple since, we're getting a lot of mushroom material. So again, we're able to support that residual stand while we get this benefit. And so this is kind of what a typical harvest might look like. So this is the big question, and it's something we're going to look at exploring and continue to have conversation with. But it's mentioned in some old mushroom literature. It sort of makes sense from a biological perspective but there's still a lot of questions that remain about how important the amount of sapwood is for mushroom production. So I mentioned that example before. When you have a tree that's grown and is incredibly suppressed, 90 years old, and it's only a few inches in diameter, there's two things that are going on there. One is that the rings are much tighter together. And the second thing is the amount of heartwood is likely to be higher in that tree. Now, there's a lot of other stressors, a lot of other factors that it depends, but a tree that's grown in underneath and sort of suppressed conditions for decades upon decades is likely to be lower in productivity than one that's grown in more open conditions. So we think about an abandoned farm field, and the trees growing up initially, and maybe after 20 or 30 or 40 years, we have trees that are 4 or 5 inches in diameter, but they've had a lot of access to sunlight as they've grown. So those rings are going to be further apart in that scenario. And so, we can look at one measure, some species like oak, walnut, it's very easy to see the heartwood versus the sapwood. Other species like beech, birch, and maple, it's often really challenging to see that heartwood. So the question, we don't have any research to really show that the sapwood is such a significant contributing factor, but what we generally recommend to growers is you get the most vigorous and fast growing trees. So, that 4 or 5 inch diameter tree should be, 30, 40 years old. That's reasonable. If it's 90 years old, it might not be the best to choose for mushroom. It might be better for the firewood pile. So we're considering ways we can continue, think about doing research to sort of back this up, but it's kind of a consideration. I wouldn't, again, we don't want to encourage folks to avoid cutting a tree or trying it out for mushroom inoculation, but it's something to consider. We've seen the best production from trees that grow on the edges of woods, trees that have been grown in more open conditions, and also the limb wood from timber trees. So that's a strategy some growers use, is they follow loggers after timber harvest, and they might use some of the top wood. And top wood generally has a very high proportion of its sapwood. So so these are all considerations. Again, I feel a bit hesitant in saying, well, absolutely that 90-year-old tight-ringed tree is not going to be good. I think it's still going to produce mushrooms. I think it's still going to be worth your time. If we look at the economics of shiitake production, you have a lot of room to play with there. But if I'm going to choose at the end of the day between a tree that's more vigorous and less vigorous, I'm going to go with the one that's been vigorously growing as it's grown in the woods. So interestingly enough, another in relationship to this that I think is important is to look at how these cultures in Asia have been growing and producing shiitake mushrooms. Whoops, sorry. I lost my slide there for a second. So this is a picture from a hillside in Japan. And traditionally, the way that shiitake bolts were harvested were on short rotation coppices, so C-O-P-P-I-C-E. And coppice refers to a management technique where you basically cut a tree to the ground. Sometimes you cut it above browse height if you're concerned or have grazing animals or are concerned about over deer pressure. You cut it 4 or 5 feet off the ground. But with shiitake, mostly it was ground stumps that were cut down to the ground, and then they were encouraged and allowed to resprout and regrow. And so what would happen is, if you've ever seen this stump sprouting, occasionally a stump will have, usually dozens of shoots that'll come back up, and then the farmers will go in there and they'll prune out a few, and they'll maybe cultivate, 5 or 6 of them, and they'll grow them out to be 4 or 5 inches in diameter. So they're going to get logs that are grown pretty vigorously off an established root system of that tree. Some of these coppices in Japan are hundreds of years old, have been managed in that way. So you get really vigorous growth. You get it in open sun conditions, and these are essentially small clear cuts, as small as a quarter or half an acre, and sometimes several acres in size. And in Japan, what it is generally about a 15 to 20 year rotation. So some folks in the States, sometimes you get to inherit your grandfather's or your grandparents' your apple orchard or something. Well, some folks in Japan get to inherit their predecessors' coppice grow for shiitake bolts, right? So it's a consideration, something to think about. It's something we could play with more on this side of the ocean and think about. But this is going to produce really high sapwood, vigorous, healthy growing trees, and we should probably gain a bit of that wisdom of something that's been going on for 1,000 years, the way that the wood is cultivated. So mimicking those conditions, perhaps playing with coppice. One of the things we're doing at our farm is planting trees in open pasture and thinking about growing them up and then coppicing them and looking at the potential. These are all things that are interesting in this conversation, at least in the long term, I would say. So here's just an example. You could have a tree that isn't actually coppiced, cut it down to the stump, you get your new growth, and then you actually prune and cultivate a select number of those shoots into whatever you're looking for. And what's really key with coppice that folks forget about sometimes is that it's not just cutting an isolated tree in the middle of the woods and thinking it's going to stump sprout. What it generally takes is enough of a gap in the canopy or enough of a clearing or a small clear cut so that you get sufficient sunlight to stimulate that growth. And coppicing is generally done in the dormant season. So usually January is the prime month to coppice. You cut these materials and then you support that growth. Now, in parts of the states, this is an interesting prospect, I think. The challenge we have is with deer browse. So we're going to have to think about ways to protect these sprouts from deer. So regardless of where you're going to source bolts, we want to think about pricing them. And this is really where I leaned a bit on Wisconsin, the Growers Network I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And these aren't fixed prices, and we certainly aren't, these are proposals, and prices are always negotiable. So it really depends on the situation and what's required. But I just want to give you a sense of what we've seen and what seems to be kind of the going rates for things. And it's going to ultimately be up to you or the folks you're surveying or a conversation between the buyer and the seller to figure this out. So what we figure is, and this is math that the folks in Wisconsin did, that the equivalent volume of wood to a cord of firewood is about the equivalent of 150 3-foot long bolts for mushroom production, right? And so there's a premium, I think, that should be paid versus firewood to really take the time to maintain that quality and minimize the damage. So you can see the prices actually work out to be considerably higher per cord than what we see generally for firewood. So if I was seeking logs and I called up a site and I knew, like, my neighbor, for instance, was logging his woods, and I said, hey, can I go over there and cut up the tops from bolts? I'll go over there, I'll use my own equipment, I'll cut them up, I'll put them in the truck, all that sort of stuff. I might pay him 50 cents a bolt for access to those, but I'm going to do most of the work, right? If the logger of that job happened to say, hey, you know what, I don't mind dragging those tops out, I'll leave them at the landing for you, you just have to pick them up and buck them up and throw them in your vehicle. And that can be especially useful in sites where it's not easily accessible, the woods. Maybe I'll pay $1 a bolt. If someone's going to do all that work, they're going to find the wood, cut it, move it, cut it into length, and then deliver it, then I'm going to pay more like $2 to $3 per bolt. All right, so per 3-foot length is kind of what we're going for here. And in conversations with different service providers, or I should say contractors in a sense, sometimes folks are talking about delivering in 6-foot lengths because it's easier for their truck, or 12-foot lengths or 9-foot lengths, depending on the like a triaxle load or a flatbed or something like that. So some people are saying, well, I actually just want to charge by the linear foot. So that would equate to about 50 cents to $1 per linear foot, if you think about it in that way. And that's partially a little bit lower because a little less labor in cutting them up into 3-foot bolts. That's something the landowner is still, or the grower is still going to have to do. So if we just take the scenario of I'm going to start a little business, I'm going to cut and sell and deliver bolts, then I might be able to make around $300 to $450 a cord in that kind of scenario. All right. But again, these prices aren't fixed, and we're open to feedback and hearing how this works. The guy I work with, my friend, I asked him to sort of keep records. We were having an interesting conversation about that, and he found for himself that he felt like delivery, if it was close enough to the job site within like 10 miles, that he felt like $250 a bolt was sustainable for him, that he actually could justify the work. And he said if it was any more than 10 miles, he'd probably have to charge a delivery fee. So that's another consideration, is you charge something per bolt and then add on the a delivery fee, something like that. So when I talk to growers, sorry, I keep hitting that key. When I talk to growers, we're gonna have to cycle through these slides. Sorry about that. Quick review here, flash review. Okay, great. So when I talk to landowners about the potential, often folks come to us interested in growing mushrooms. I just want to point out this kind of list of possibilities. So certainly you could get into mushroom production and sell fresh and or dried products. That's a piece. And these are all sort of either or and. You could do one of these things, you could do multiples of these things. So cutting, going to someone's land for them and cutting bolts is definitely a service that I'm hearing people talking about. You could also cut and inoculate and sell logs that are ready to fruit. It costs, what we figured out, is about $5 per 3-foot bolt in terms of materials and labor to inoculate it. And you can generally sell those, if they're ready to fruit, for $10 to $20, depending on the market. So we do these every year. We have a few holiday markets that our farm attends, and we sell them, and they're quite popular. People really like the idea of giving the gift of mushrooms in bolt form. So this is a possible side enterprise, and there's a few folks I've had conversations with that say, I have a woodlot, I'm retired, I'm really interested in doing this. I'm going to cut a bunch of trees, I'm going to inoculate them, I'm going to try to sell those as a lot to a homeowner or a grower that actually wants to sell them. And there's a guy I've been talking to who he might just do this for a vegetable farm. The vegetable farm is interested in managing and selling the mushrooms, and the fellow is interested in doing the logging and the inoculation. And so they're trying to work out a price, because the farm can't really afford, 100 logs at $20 a log. But if it's, less than $5 a log, it's not good for him. So they're in negotiation to try to figure out what will work for them. We've had people offer log inoculation at events to actually use as an educational tool. That can be a way to offer something to the community. And we've actually had folks also set up the entire fruiting yard. So literally someone says, I want you to come site it, provide the log, set it up, and actually have a system up and going that I can just, step into and start soaking and harvesting. So just some potentials there. Let's talk quickly about relationship of mushroom bolts to firewood. So in New York State, except for where federal quarantines apply, and Peter can correct me if I'm wrong with anything when we get to questions. Generally, firewood is not allowed to be transported more than 50 miles. We're sort of in these different zones. Unless you're in a quarantine zone, then it really can't leave that zone. And so there was a question early on if mushroom bolts really applied to that. And when New York State originally came out with this, the DEC came out with this ruling, and it's a good policy. I think it makes sense. We want to minimize the transportation of some of the forest pests and things that we're concerned with. So, but when it first came out, it was sort of blanketed to many forest products. There was some feedback from the industry that said this isn't going to work for us because our markets are all over the place. And so the law was switched to sort of amended to be very specific to wood that was intended for use as firewood. So that's really, it's a question at the end of intent and how you're going to use it. So this is the standard, but they revised it to really be clear that if you intended to use it as firewood, then it was under the restriction. If it's used for another purpose, so farmers, manufacturing, wood products, it's exempt from that ruling. Now, it doesn't exempt us from being considerate, proactive, and aware of the potential for forest pests in our woods and making note of that. Obviously, this goes really well hand in hand with mushroom production, because if we're looking for fresh wood that we want to inoculate, we're going to also be looking for any insect or disease issues that they're not going to make that a viable log. What is recommended, what the DC has recommended in my conversations with them, is just like with firewood, is that if you get into the business of moving logs around and delivering logs, that you document your work, and you're really clear about the intention of the logs, where they're coming from, where they're going to, and that you have a paper trail with that. So this is a requirement for any firewood that's sold in New York State, and I think it basically applies. You could basically use this template to create some kind of paper trail for logs that you were buying or selling. There's a small report on this, the impact of sort of firewood regulations in relationship to mushrooms, on the cornellmushrooms.org website. This is just an example of some of the species we were looking at. One of the interesting things is some of the invasive pests of most concern. Those would be the woolly adelgid and the emerald ash borer. those grow on tree species in the case of the adelgid and ash, the ash borers on ash, of course. These aren't species that we actually use for mushroom cultivation. So the other good news around this is moving mushroom bolts around. We're not really exposing ourselves to a high risk, at least at this point. Some of these insects and diseases mentioned on here certainly have some potential in New York and in other places, but aren't super persistent at this point, with the exception of the Asian longhorn beetle in some of the areas. So it's important to be informed. It's important to know, as far as the actual rules go at this point, mushroom bolts don't really count, but we should still be vigilant and good at our observations. There's a New York invasive species information website. You can see the link there at the bottom of the slide, nyis.info. So just to wrap up, a couple things we're offering. On our website, if you go to /suppliers, or if you just go to the homepage and click on the supplier tab, we actually have a directory started of folks who are interested in offering logs for sale. This is an old image, so we actually have maybe 15 or so on that map. And I think I need to update it again. I think there's been a few more. And so basically you can click on those icons and get information and contact for folks who are able to supply bolts. So this is just the beginning of something we're trying to offer as a resource for folks, at least in New York State. And we also, on that page, have a fact sheet that basically summarizes what I've talked about in this presentation. And it's something we designed so you can print it and hand it to folks. So if you're looking to buy logs, you can hand this to a seller and say, this is what I really need. If you're interested in selling them, then you can really get up to speed on what the necessary requirements would be for this type of production. So that can be found on our website, downloadable as a PDF. So that's the end for me. I'll just share a few resources, and I'm happy to take any additional questions. I'm really curious to hear feedback from folks, whatever perspective you're coming from as a resource professional or a practitioner or a logger or a forester. I really want to learn about what you see as different aspects to allow this to succeed. This is a very new and sort of burgeoning aspect of wood products, so we have a lot of questions. And a lot of the things I'm getting feedback on now are around the logistics of handling these types of transactions. So wherever we can be supportive, I'm happy to do that. So please do share that information with me via email, or if you want to have a conversation, just reach out. If you're interested in being a source for bolts, you can actually sign up for the directory if you go to that website. Or if you know folks, if you're an extension person or you know people who might be interested, please inform them of this opportunity to sign up for the directory and share their contact information. And we always love pictures of the process, seeing how people are handling logs, what kind of trailers, what kind of loading devices to minimize damage. Anything folks want to share, I'm always welcome to see. Finally, I'll just mention we have a mushroom grower listserv for New York State. There's information, I'll leave this slide up on how to join that. And that can be not just for mushroom growers, but if you're interested in supplying or supporting the industry, that's a great place to keep up to date with information and the conversations that are going on. And the majority of conversation is around the practice of cultivation. So a lot of growers sharing their best tips and advice. So that's what I got for this. I will happily take any questions and hang out for a few minutes so we can.
All right. Steve, thank you. Very good presentation. There are some questions that have come in. I've got one and so if you all have questions, this is a good time to be typing them in. For the people that would be selling bolts, what kind of quantities is there? I mean, I'm sure it would vary from buyer to buyer, but what kind of, or do people usually want 5 bolts? Do they want 50 bolts? Do they want 300 bolts? Do you have a sense of what kind of demand would somebody put forward?
Yeah, so it's going to depend, of course. I would say that, so for our farm, for instance, we produce on about 1,000 active logs, and to maintain that level, because some logs are always going out of production and we need new ones, we do about 400 new ones a year. Mm-hmm. So for us, and that's a pretty small scale production. So basically farms generally are doing between 1,000 and 3,000 bolts. So on that scale, I would say somewhere between 400 and 1,000 bolts would be in demand. As folks are getting started, it's more often 100 or 200. at a time. But I know, again, my friend who's servicing 3 or 4, he sold to each grower, I think, around 500. So he ended up selling about 2,000 bolts in total. All right, so I'm just scrolling up here. Tim's asking about my experience with red maple. So unfortunately, Tim, we found that red maple is a pretty poorly performing species. It's not on par with sugar maple. It will fruit shiitake, but at a very low level, and the bark also tends to last much less, much shorter duration than the sugar maple. So we don't actually recommend it for cultivation. And then Tom's asking about birch. So yeah, birch is a good species. Black birch, as you're mentioning there, is perfectly fine. We have a grower near us that grows almost exclusively, and I've seen folks using yellow and paper birch as well. So it's a good one for that. So and yeah, when I said red maple, we're talking about soft maple, at least what most people think of as soft maple. Let's see. And then we have a question about oak species. Basically, all of the oak species are perfectly acceptable. Really not a huge difference between them in terms of production.
So white oak has equal production to red oak. I mean, I would have thought that the plugs in the vessel, the tyloses, would have,
right.
but there's no real difference.
I mean, I should be clear, we haven't done comparative research on the various oak species. We used red oak for the main trials, which compared red oak, sugar maple, and beech. But we have folks growing on white oak and not reporting, significant.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. They keep us guessing.
I would never. Okay. Good. Sorry. And then so Jake has a question about the branches on the bolts, and that one came in when you were talking in the webinar about using topwood.
Right.
And so how do you a lot of times that topwood, it's hard to get, there's going to be branches. How do you cut those out, or what's the threshold that you can tolerate?
Generally, you can cut any branches sort of flush with the bolt and then wax over that end, and you should be fine. Yeah.
Okay. Alexander's asking how often you need to replace the bolts, or how many growing seasons do you get out of a bolt?
Yeah, generally our research found on average about 3 seasons of production. And I didn't mention that that kind of depends on how much you soak the log. So once you soak it and fruit it, you actually have to let it rest for about 7 weeks before you can soak it again. So generally in a season, you can soak a log two to 3 times. So depending on how intensively you manage, that'll kind of determine its shelf life. So I see in our production and many folks that the first 2 years of a log's life are its most productive. The 3rd year it starts to decline, and the 4th year it's almost not worth it. So that's kind of, a lot of folks will plan on a 3-year lifespan of their log.
Okay. And Brent wants to know if you can split large diameter bolts.
Oh yeah, no, unfortunately, we need that bark layer entirely intact. So, and I've had questions about using slab wood and using all sorts of different things, but really you have to have a round, entirely sort of sheathed bolt. So it really doesn't work to split them.
Okay. Russell says, how many mushrooms do you typically get with one bolt?
Yeah, so typically, again, the research we did found every time you soak a bolt, it's about, on average, 1/4 to 1/2 pound per log, per flush. That's an average over, many logs, because the rates, of course, vary. But that's been pretty consistent. We found at our mushroom yard that we average about 1/3 of, so it's right in the middle of those two. And then over the lifetime, we usually get about 4 pounds total. So again, it's kind of distributed through those different flushes. So you can say about 4 pounds total out of a log, and each time is somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 pound.
All right. Susan said that she inoculated lots of bolts in the spring with shiitake spawn and lion's mane, and some of the bolts with lion's mane are sprouting leaves. Is that an issue?
I'm curious if they're actually freestanding bolts or if they're like stumps, because that's kind of surprising. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about it being an issue.
Yeah, I think those leaves are going to die pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Chris wants to know if you have any experience with, as boltwood, with black gum, elm, sassafras, or hackberry.
All right. I don't personally, but I know that black gum is a common species used in the South. Elm, I've heard, is best for oyster production. It's a softer wood. I can't say I know about sassafras or hackberry, but I always recommend, if you have an abundant species that isn't on our sort of preferred list, is that you try 10 bolts and see, because you never know. That's how we found out about birch, is just that people tried it and it worked.
Okay, Carl says, wants to know if there are any other forest mushrooms that could be marketed in addition to shiitake mushrooms.
Yeah, I mean, any forest mushroom can be marketed pretty well. There's definitely an interest and demand for them. The challenge, as I mentioned, was consistency. So we tend to, at our farm, we tend to get a nice flush of lion's mane in the fall. So I can easily sell those, but it's usually 1 or 2 weeks out of the whole year. And that's the challenge I found is, and what I recommend to other growers is you build a market with shiitake, or if you want to do oyster, you really need to do it in these kind of climate, more controlled environments. You can get weekly fruiting. So build a business off those, and then you can kind of supplement it with, lion's mane or other ones that might pop up in the woods. Yeah.
Okay. Jerry says that if you're cutting your beech trees in the fall so that you can do an herbicide stump treatment, would those cut bolts still be fresh enough the following spring in March or April to inoculate? So how long can you hold a bolt after cutting before you inoculate it?
Yeah. I mean, we usually recommend no more than 3 months. The caveat of that is that winter is a pretty sterile time out in the world, so there's not a lot of fungal contamination happening. But I would be cautious about that. I would prefer, if you said you're going to cut in the fall, that you'd try to inoculate in the fall and get them going, even if they only grow for a little bit before they go dormant, because waiting that long might really expose you to risk.
Okay. Andy says that he tried to join the listserv, but his email program told him it was an invalid address. He says he didn't think it liked the dashes. So he wants you to confirm that the email that you have there is. So one thing we can do, Steve, if you want to send me an email with that listserv address, I can send that to everyone who registered for the webinar.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. And the dashes they are accurate. So
right. Yeah.
If was it Andy? If Andy, if you want to send me an email, so I have your email, I can probably manually add you to the list from the back end, and then that might work if you're not having a good luck with this method.
Okay. So. All right. The questions keep bouncing around, so I'm trying to. Todd says, "Are you seeing a regional concentration in location demand for bolts by commercial growers? Which part of the state?"
Not. I wouldn't say not yet. I think we're not prolific enough yet. I do see more activity, I would say, happening in the Hudson Valley, though, down in that area so far. But I wouldn't say it's significant.
Okay. So Chris says, if a cost share program existed to help encourage this business or this industry, what items would you like to see included?
Oh, that's a great question. Hopefully he's offering one on the table. So
Right. Get your checkbook out, Chris.
um, it's interesting because there's an example in North Carolina where the state invested in shiitake cultivation by providing people with free spawn and instruction. And actually that somewhat backfired because it grew the industry too quickly, and then the price kind of fell really quickly. So I don't think the spawn and the materials are the big cost. It's what we found through research is that 50% of the labor that goes into mushroom cultivation in this way, the log grown, is in felling the trees and inoculating bolts. So whether that's helping folks, providing them with the equipment or the setup to make inoculation efficient, or I think tying this into, when I think of cost share, I also think of the cost of managing land, the cost of doing some of the timber stand improvement or crop tree management. I think those kind of things would serve people really well, to do, I think, good for their land and to help get them started. So and it would really be great, honestly, if I'm dreaming big. I think that a lot of these growers that are just getting excited are spending a lot of time just trying to source bolts. So if we were able to say there's an easy way to provide someone with 200 bolts, just to get them started, I think that would be a big help.
So what's the when I think about the New York State Maple Producers Association, that's an organization that puts a lot of effort into kind of helping connect people through marketplaces to buy and sell used evaporators, to advertise, to encourage the sale of New York State maple. Is there a similar, related to this question, is there a similar industry, a trade association, and maybe that if there's an investment, maybe it would be in helping to build and facilitate that trade association?
Yeah, I think right now we sort of have what we call a network, of people checking it out, right? I think once we have a few hundred established commercial growers, then we start to have enough momentum to organize. And I'm encouraging, from the extension end, we can support that, but I think it has to be from the growers that really build that up. So I think we're just not that critical mass, but I think it would be super, super useful. Yeah. And I think it's coming.
What remind me, Steve, in the last year or so, you'd worked to allow language such that mushroom bolts were considered part of ag assessment. Is that right? Maybe I'm mixing things up here.
Yeah,
so is that a go ahead?
So what was happening was two things with ag assessment. If folks aren't familiar in New York, if you're grossing $10,000 of agricultural sales, then you can basically get a tax exemption on the land that is used in production. And so what was happening was, first of all, mushrooms, when the state and others were thinking about mushrooms, they're thinking about people wild harvesting versus actually actively cultivating. And the other thing that was happening was that tax assessors in different townships weren't seeing that. They were seeing the productive area as just the area where the logs are being managed, when in actuality you need the forested acreage and more space than that. So we clarified that with the tax code to sort of define intentionally grown mushrooms as a crop. And so it should be now eligible anywhere in the state for ag exemption. And it shouldn't just be the lane yard, but the associated woods for management. And that mushrooms then are the only crop other than maple syrup that are a woodland product that you can apply to that entire 10,000 amount. A farm can do up to 2,000 of that 10,000 in other wood products, but only mushrooms and maple are eligible for the whole lot.
All right, that was a big deal. So
yeah.
All right, then I had a follow-up question. You were talking about coppice, which is an interesting management system. Do you know of anybody in New York or the Northeast that's doing that, whether for maple bolts or just as a way to grow, wood? Is there an example of that? Somebody's tried that, do you know? Are you doing that on your farm?
We're just 5 years in, so we're starting to play with it. We mostly use it we're mostly experimenting with for fodder for animals,
Uh-huh.
and kind of silvopasture. I planted a bunch of alders with the hope of coppicing them for bolts, but a lot of them died. So
Right.
we were trying to use red alder.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not quite gonna happen. So the answer is no. We haven't. You can go to England and you trip across coppices. It's a very common practice, and I would say that it's very, if there's examples out there, they're not, they're sort of scattered and not well developed
Right.
at this point. So
Because I'm thinking of an area out at the Arnott Forest where we could, I mean, just kind of one of those hip pocket projects that'd be fun to put into place and see if it would work. That would be a place to stop and talk to people if somebody wanted to see an example of it. So, but I was going to learn from somebody else.
well, we were just when we were out there at the Arnott today, there's a red maple stand that Brett showed me that was basically unintentional coppice regrowth. So the pattern is there. Unfortunately, it's red maple, which isn't going to be great for
Right.
for log bolts, but it's a good example. And I think I was talking to him, I said, hey, maybe that's something we could think about demonstrating and playing with, because I think there's a lot to be learned from trying it.
Right.
It's a great spot to try things out, right?
It is. That's why we're there.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I think that's the end of the questions. I want to thank you, Steve, for another great webinar. And Steve will be joining us again tonight. If you want to see this twice over, join us back at 7 p.m. If not, we'll see you hopefully in September. We always take August off from webinars because no one ever shows up. So we stopped doing August webinars, but we'll be back in September. So thank you again, Steve, and I'll see you tonight about 10 till 7 if that works for you.
Yes, sounds good.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks.